The ceasefire lasted less than 24 hours, less than one full rotation of the Earth. And when it collapsed, it didn't collapse quietly. It collapsed with 182 people dead in Lebanon. The Strait of Hormuz slamming shut again. Oil markets erasing a historic 13% gain in a single session. And 3 different versions of the same peace agreement floating around diplomatic channels, each one saying something different about what was actually agreed. This is not a story about a ceasefire that failed. This is a story about a ceasefire that was designed to fail. And the person who designed it to fail is not Iran. It's not even the obvious answer you're already thinking. Stay with me, because the next 15 minutes are going to completely change how you understand what is happening in the Middle East right now. Let me set the scene for you. April 7th, 2026. The announcement drops. A ceasefire. After 40 days of war that had shut down the world's most critical oil corridor, threatened Gulf refineries, displaced over 1 million Lebanese civilians, and pushed global energy markets into a state of near-permanent panic, it was over. The Strait of Hormuz was going to reopen. Oil prices crashed 13% in a single session. 13%. That is one of the largest single-day oil price collapses in modern history. Markets in Tokyo surge. Sydney surge. New York surge. Trump was posting about the golden age of the Middle East. Pakistan's Prime Minister was inviting delegations to Islamabad for what he called historic talks. The whole world exhaled at exactly the same moment, and that exhale, that collective global sigh of relief, lasted less than 24 hours. Because here's what nobody was paying attention to while the champagne was metaphorically being poured. The ceasefire announcement contained 5 words that were a time bomb. 5 words buried inside Netanyahu's office statement that should have sent every diplomatic analyst in the world into a cold sweat the moment they read it. The ceasefire, Netanyahu's office said, does not include Lebanon. 5 words. And those 5 words are the reason that right now, as you're watching this, the Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed. Hezbollah rockets have resumed hitting northern Israel, and the Islamabad peace talks are beginning under conditions that make their success feel almost mathematically impossible. To understand why those 5 words matter so much, you need to understand the specific architecture of what Iran actually agreed to, and more importantly, what Iran says it was promised in return. Because this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. It's not just that the ceasefire broke down. It's that it broke down because there were apparently 3 completely different versions of the agreement in circulation simultaneously. Not 2, 3. Vice President J.D. Vance himself confirmed this. 3 separate 10-point proposals, each one saying something slightly, or in some cases dramatically different, about the terms of the deal. One version in English for international wire services. One version in Farsi for Iranian domestic consumption that includes a phrase about the acceptance of enrichment that doesn't appear in the English version. And a third version published by the IRGC's own semi-official news agency that goes further than either of the other 2, claiming the United States committed to guaranteeing non-aggression, withdrawing all American combat forces from the region, lifting every primary and secondary sanction, terminating all UN Security Council resolutions against Iran, and paying Iran compensation. 3 documents, 3 audiences, 3 completely different descriptions of what was supposedly agreed. When Vance confirmed this, he described it as contributing to confusion. That is an interesting word for a situation where the document that defines whether a war continues or ends exists in 3 mutually contradictory versions. But that's where we are. Now here's what actually happened on April 8th, the first full day of the ceasefire that was supposed to have ended the worst geopolitical crisis in a generation. Israel launched what the IDF themselves described as their largest coordinated strikes on Lebanon since the war began. 100 separate strike packages in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Beirut's Corniche Al-Mazrour neighborhood was hit. Residential buildings came down. First responders were pulling people from rubble. By the end of the day, Lebanon's health ministry reported 182 people killed, the single deadliest day of the entire Lebanon campaign. More than 1 million Lebanese civilians who had been preparing to return to their homes after 6 weeks of displacement were told to stay where they were. Israel simultaneously issued fresh evacuation orders for Beirut's southern suburbs. The ceasefire was less than 18 hours old. Iran's response was immediate. the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that, in response to Israeli ceasefire violations in Lebanon, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz had stopped. Just like that, the strait closed again. The oil tankers that had just cautiously begun moving toward the entrance of the world's most important maritime choke point stopped. The 13% price collapse evaporated. The golden age of the Middle East lasted less than a day. And then something happened that reveals just how deep the disconnect between official statements and observable reality has become. The White House press secretary stood in front of reporters and said Iran's reports that the strait was closed were false. The Secretary of Defense held a Pentagon briefing and said the Strait of Hormuz had reopened in accordance with the ceasefire. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs said the same thing. False, said the White House. Open, said the Pentagon. And simultaneously, in the actual Strait of Hormuz, shipping was not moving. Bloomberg reported on Thursday morning that the strait remained largely closed, falling short of the key American condition for the ceasefire. Two separate senior American officials told the world the strait was open. The strait was not open. That gap between the official statement and the observable physical reality is not a communications problem. That gap is the entire ceasefire crisis in miniature. To understand why Israel struck Lebanon so hard on the first day of a ceasefire that the entire world was celebrating, you have to understand the specific political logic that Netanyahu is operating under right now. And I want to be precise here, because this is not about demonizing a leader or oversimplifying a complicated situation. This is about understanding the cold, rational political calculation being made in Jerusalem, because that calculation is the engine driving everything that is happening. Netanyahu's political survival in Israel depends on military results. His coalition government contains ministers who have staked their political existence on the destruction of Hezbollah. The ground invasion of Lebanon that began on March 3rd, the systematic strikes on Hezbollah's military infrastructure, the promise to his electorate that this war would end with Hezbollah sufficiently degraded that it can never again fire rockets into northern Israel. All of that is what keeps his government standing. And here is the nightmare scenario for Netanyahu. If the Islamabad talks proceed and produce a framework that includes Lebanon, which Iran insists is a non-negotiable condition and which Pakistan's Prime Minister has publicly confirmed is included, then Netanyahu's Lebanon campaign is terminated by his principal allies' diplomatic decision. Everything stops at an American negotiating table in Pakistan before Hezbollah is destroyed. The ground invasion ends, the strikes stop, and Netanyahu has to go back to his electorate and explain why 6 weeks of war ended without the victory he promised them. For a prime minister whose domestic political survival is tied directly to military results that only this war can deliver, that outcome isn't just politically damaging, it's existential. So the calculation he's running, and this is the calculation that the Arab League chief was describing when he accused Israel of persistently seeking to sabotage the ceasefire deal, not accidentally complicating it, not inadvertently triggering escalation, but persistently, deliberately sabotaging. The calculation is this: if I bomb Lebanon hard enough, fast enough, with enough force that Iran cannot ignore it, the Islamabad process breaks down before it formalizes Lebanon's inclusion in the ceasefire. And if Islamabad breaks down, the war continues. And if the war continues, I still have a political reason to exist. The Arab League's accusation matters here because the Arab League is not a natural Iranian ally. These are 22 Arab states with their own complex, historically ambivalent, sometimes deeply hostile relationship with Tehran. And they are looking at the sequence of events, the ceasefire announcement, the immediate massive Lebanon strikes, the Hormuz closure, the rockets, the counterstrikes, and they are arriving at the same conclusion that Pakistan's more diplomatically careful statement was pointing toward when the Prime Minister said violations of the ceasefire have been reported at few places across the conflict zone, which undermine the spirit of the peace process. Pakistan is preserving the negotiations. The Arab League is not. Israel is sabotaging the deal on purpose, and the regional body representing 22 Arab states is willing to say so publicly. Now let's talk about what Iran actually claims it agreed to, because the IRGC's statement through Tasnim news agency, that's Iran's semi-official news service affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, is the most detailed public accounting of what Tehran says it achieved in these negotiations that any Iranian official source has yet produced. And if you read it, it should stop you cold. The statement says, Tehran forced the United States to accept its 10-point plan, in which America committed in principle to guaranteeing non-aggression, continuing Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, accepting uranium enrichment, lifting all primary and secondary sanctions, terminating all resolutions of the UN Security Council and the IAEA Board of Governors against Iran, paying Iran compensation, withdrawing American combat forces from the region, and stopping the war on all fronts, including against what the statement calls the heroic Lebanese Islamic resistance. Every single item, written down, published by the IRGC's own news agency. Now there are only two possible interpretations of that statement. Either the United States agreed to give Iran essentially everything it has ever demanded before the Islamabad talks even begin, in which case the American diplomatic position is one of the most extraordinary capitulations in the history of modern international relations, or Iran is publicly claiming commitments that America never made, and the foundation of the entire Islamabad process is a fiction that both parties are pretending is a shared reality. The White House has dismissed Iran's characterization of the enrichment commitment as a mischaracterization, but dismissing it doesn't make the three different documents disappear. It doesn't reconcile the version that Iran published for its own domestic audience with the version that went out on international wire services. It doesn't answer why the IRGC's news agency felt confident enough to publish a detailed list of American concessions if those concessions were pure invention. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf didn't wait long to make his accusation formal. He issued a statement on April 8th accusing the United States of violating 3 of Iran's 10 conditions within hours of the ceasefire taking effect. Violation 1. Israel's attacks on Lebanon, which Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araki said the U.S. had committed to stopping as part of the framework. Violation 2. A drone that entered Iranian airspace after the ceasefire was announced. Violation 3. The denial of Iran's right to enrich uranium. 3 violations, less than 24 hours. And he framed it in language that tells you everything about the depth of Iranian institutional distrust toward America. He cited what he called Iran's deep historical distrust of the United States, its repeated violations of all forms of commitments, and described this latest episode as a pattern that has regrettably been repeated once again. Iran's parliament speaker was accusing America of breaking the ceasefire before the ceasefire had completed its first day. The drone violation accusation is particularly revealing about the operational reality of ending a war. The United States military had been flying surveillance and combat drones over and around Iranian territory for 40 days of intensive operations. The command structures, the standing mission parameters, the operational orders that sent drones into Iranian airspace on an hourly basis during the war. None of that stops the moment a social media post announces a ceasefire. Orders have to flow down through chains of command. Missions have to be recalled. Field commanders have to receive new instructions that override standing orders that had been in place for weeks. In the hours after the ceasefire announcement, while the White House was posting about golden ages and oil markets were surging, American military machinery that had been running at full combat tempo for 6 weeks was still in motion. Whether that drone entered Iranian airspace because someone ordered it to, or because the word hadn't reached the relevant command level yet, or because the ceasefire terms about Iranian airspace hadn't been translated into the operational military language that field commanders actually work from, that question may never be publicly answered, but it's sitting in Ghalibaf's public statement as documented evidence of American bad faith, and it will be in every Iranian briefing document going into Islamabad. There's one more incident from April 8th that has received almost no attention in Western coverage, and it matters enormously. The Iran Lavan oil refinery was struck around 10 in the morning local time after the ceasefire had taken effect. Iranian officials reported the attack. Israel's military said they were not behind it. Nobody claimed responsibility. An unidentified strike on an Iranian oil refinery in the hours after a ceasefire that Iran agreed to specifically in exchange for the suspension of strikes on Iranian infrastructure. No claimed responsibility, no explanation, just a burning refinery and a ceasefire that was already struggling to survive its first morning. And while all of this was happening, the Lebanon strikes, the Hormuz closure, the refinery attack, the drone accusation, Kuwait's army was reporting that drone attacks had caused significant damage to oil facilities, power stations, and water desalination plants on April 8th. People were being injured by falling debris in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE's main gas complex caught fire. This is the physical reality of what it means when a war doesn't end instantaneously at the moment a political decision is made to stop it. The ceasefire was a decision made in Washington. The war was a physical reality being conducted by military systems operating on their own momentum. Missiles already in flight, don't turn around. Operations already underway, don't pause mid-execution. The gap between the political decision and the military reality is where the first day of this ceasefire lived. And the cost of that gap was measured in dead civilians, burning refineries, and a strait that was supposed to be open and wasn't. Tom Closa, the chief energy advisor for Gulf Oil, put it in terms that everyone watching oil prices should print out and keep. He told CNN that there is just a trickle leaving the region, that the ceasefire looks flimsy, and that the world is weeks away from even 50 or 70% of Strait of Hormuz traffic being restored. Weeks, not days. Even in the best case scenario where the Islamabad talks somehow produce a durable agreement this weekend, the physical infrastructure of global oil supply that flows through that strait doesn't normalize overnight. The tanker captains don't just resume normal operations because a diplomat signed a paper. They wait until the strait is demonstrably, verifiably, sustainably safe. And right now, it isn't. Here is the chain of causation that connects your gas prices to the Beirut airstrikes. Israel strikes Lebanon. Iran closes Hormuz. Oil supply from the region drops. Global oil prices rise. Every person filling a gas tank in America or Europe pays more. The connection is direct and unbroken. Every day that Netanyahu's Lebanon campaign continues is another day that the economic pressure that forced the ceasefire in the first place keeps building. And here's the brutal irony buried inside that pressure. That building economic pressure is actually the strongest argument for the Islamabad process to succeed. Because the alternative to Islamabad working is a return to full-scale war. And a return to full-scale war means oil at $150 a barrel. Iranian missiles targeting Gulf refineries, not just as warning shots, but as sustained campaign strikes. Hormuz not temporarily restricted, but potentially closed for weeks or months. A global economic shock that makes the last 40 days look like a gentle prelude to something far worse. Which is why the Islamabad talks are happening on Saturday despite everything. Despite the Hormuz closure, despite 182 dead in Lebanon, despite 3 incompatible versions of the same agreement, despite Hezbollah rockets resuming on the morning of April 9th, their first attack since the ceasefire was announced, a direct response to Israel's Lebanon strikes, proof that the cycle of retaliation is already fully operational again. Despite Netanyahu going on television and saying Israel was ready to return to fighting at any time and that his finger was on the trigger, despite all of it, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are flying to Islamabad because the alternative to the door being open is the door being blown off its hinges. Kushner's role here deserves a moment of specific attention. This is the same man who drove the Abraham Accords at a speed that Saudi Arabia never fully consented to, whose transactional deal-making style has been reshaping the architecture of Middle Eastern diplomacy for the better part of a decade. In Islamabad, his specific task will be to take 3 mutually contradictory versions of a 10-point framework and reconcile them into a single document that both Washington and Tehran can ratify without triggering their own domestic political collapses. The American version and the Iranian version describe different realities. The Iranian domestic version adds nuclear enrichment language that doesn't appear in the international version. The IRGC version goes further still. Kushner needs to find language that lets the White House say it didn't capitulate on enrichment while simultaneously letting Tehran tell its domestic audience that it preserved its nuclear program. That is not a negotiation. That is a form of diplomatic alchemy. And it has to happen while Netanyahu is bombing Lebanon and Iran is keeping Hormuz closed and Hezbollah rockets are hitting northern Israel, and oil markets are watching every hour for signals about what comes next. Iran's Foreign Minister Araki put the pressure on America as directly as diplomatic language allows when he posted that the world sees the massacres in Lebanon and that the ball is in the U.S. court, and the world is watching whether it will act on its commitments. That is a very specific diplomatic statement. It is Iran telling the United States publicly that it agreed in the ceasefire framework to ensure Lebanon was included. Trump, when asked by a reporter why Lebanon wasn't in the ceasefire, said because of Hezbollah, they were not included in the deal, and that it would get taken care of too. Two governments, one ceasefire agreement. Two completely different descriptions of what was in it. And 182 dead in Lebanon on the first day of the peace. What happens in Islamabad on Saturday will determine whether the last door stays open or slams shut. The American delegation arrives representing a country whose defense secretary says the strait is open, while Bloomberg reports it is largely closed, whose president described the 10-point framework as both workable and fraudulent within the same 24 hours, and whose principal regional ally is bombing Lebanon into its deadliest days since the war began. The Iranian delegation arrives, having publicly accused America of 3 ceasefire violations before the first day was done, with their IRGC having reclosed the world's most important oil corridor, with their parliament speaker on record saying America has once again proven it cannot honor its commitments. Pakistan sits between them, trying to hold the architecture together because Pakistan understands, perhaps better than anyone else in this room, that if this framework collapses entirely, what comes next will be measured not in days of conflict, but in months. And the region and the world is not prepared for months. The ceasefire is not broken, but it is not holding. Its survival runs through one specific chain of decisions. The Strait of Hormuz reopening requires Lebanon to stop being bombed. Lebanon stopping being bombed requires Israel to accept that the ceasefire includes Lebanon. Israel accepting that requires Netanyahu to absorb a political consequence he has so far shown every indication of being unwilling to absorb. That chain is the entire story, and every link in it is under pressure from the same direction. Every person who thought the war ended on April 7th, every market that priced in the ceasefire, every family in Lebanon that started planning to go home, they are all waiting on one man's political calculation to change. The unthinkable happened. It will happen again if it doesn't.